We organized this event tonight to mark the publication in France of Jacques Ranciere's new book, Aisthesis, Scène du régime esthétique de l'art. So I would like to extend a particular warm welcome and thanks to Jacques Ranciere for coming back here. I also want to thank, as we get started, the Maison Française, and Shani Pierre and Lindsay Long, in particular for their tireless work. This event is the Maison Française's annual Eugene Sheffer Distinguished Lecture, meant in part to commemorate Eugene Sheffer, who came to Columbia in 1922, to Columbia College in 1922, and who, for many years, until 1966, I believe, was director of the Maison Française. And so we're particularly grateful to Eugene Sheffer's family for their support. And I also want to thank Dean Carlos Alonso and the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences for their support, and also the Heyman Center for the Humanities, who were immediately enthusiastic about extending an invitation to Ranciere when we first contacted them last year. So let me say just a quick word about the format tonight. Jacques Ranciere will speak first about his work, about his new work, Aisthesis. Then we'll have a series of responses and questions from our panelists, and then we'll open up to the audience for questions and discussion. I think the overwhelming response to Jacques Ranciere's presence here tonight speaks to the importance of his work, and I won't say everything I could, but let me just say that it's clear that Jacques Ranciere is one of today's most important thinkers on equality, on the possibilities of egalitarian politics, and also on the role that literature, film, art play or can play in opening possibilities of democratic thought and action. And I want just to mention three recent titles that give an indication of the broad reach of Jacques Ranciere's work. The first is Aisthesis, which was published last year with Dailey, and I've just learned that the English translation is due out in the spring?
Next spring.
Next spring with Verso.
Yes.
So maybe you can come back for that. Also last year, Mute Speech was translated, Jacques Ranciere's book Mute Speech came out at the University Press, and it was translated by James Swenson, whom we are very fortunate to have with us tonight. And Mute Speech is a major engagement on Ranciere's part with the democratic impulse in literature. And I'm sure we'll have occasion to speak about this book tonight. And I also want to mention the publication of 2 or 3 other books. As you probably know, Proletarian Nights, which was Jacques Ranciere's doctoral thesis on the Workers' Archive, was recently published or republished by Verso with a new introduction by Jacques Ranciere. And Verso also published a collection of essays, Staging the People, essays from the 70s and the 1980s, and from the journal that Jacques Ranciere directed in the 70s and 80s, Révolte de Chic. And these essays in Staging the People have taken on a new resonance today. I'm also delighted to welcome our distinguished panelists and the respondents who are from different fields and who have all engaged with and done something with Ranciere's work. So Madeleine Dobie is Associate Professor in French and Comparative Literature and a specialist of 18th century French literature, Francophone literature, and colonial history. She is the author, most recently, of Trading Places, a study of how the Enlightenment dealt with questions of slavery, and her latest book, Relire Maria Capesta, Une femme des Antilles dans l'espace colonial français, is coming out in October, next month. She's also the translator of Sarah Kaufman's book, Smothered Words, which I mention in part because Sarah Kaufman, the philosopher, was also one of the co-founders of this collection at Galilée, which is published Aisthesis along with a few other books by Jacques Ranciere. Patricia Dailey is a medievalist and associate professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature. She is the author of Promised Bodies, Time, Language, and Corporeality in Women's Mystical Text. And she is also the translator of works by Giorgio Agamben, Tony Negri, Jean-François Lyotard, and a co-founder here at Columbia of the Graduate Theory Reading Group. James Swenson is Professor of French and Dean of Humanities at Rutgers University. He has published extensively on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, including the book On Jean-Jacques Rousseau, considered as one of the first authors of the French Revolution. And he has translated numerous works by Etienne Balibar as well as by Jacques Ranciere, including, as I mentioned, Mute Speech. Nico Baumbach is assistant professor in the film program here at Columbia. He's the author of several excellent articles on Ranciere and film theory, and is currently writing a book, finishing a book on continental philosophy and film theory. So thank you to all the panelists, and now Jacques Ranciere.
So thank you to Phil Watts for organizing this event, to the Maison Française, to all the panelists, and to all of you. Well, I've been asked to speak first, which means to introduce you first to the reality of the book, which I think has for most of you only a kind of ghostly existence, you know. It has been published in French last year. It should come out next year in the English language. So, but it's my hope that at the end of the session, the ghost will have taken on some consistency. Well, to introduce the discussion, I shall try to give a short account of what I did in this book. Not what I wanted to do, because a book, in my view, is a step in a journey, rather than the result of a decision. So I shall not tell what I wanted to do, but what today I think I have done in this book, Aisthesis. Scenes from the aesthetic regime of art. Well, it's a book about the texture and logic of what I call the aesthetic regime of art. My basic assumption is that aesthetics doesn't designate a discipline dedicated to the study of art or the beautiful. It designates a regime of experience, the one within which we have been accustomed to identify artistic practices, to perceive artworks, and to give them a specific mode of intelligibility.
Well, thank you to Phil Watts and Channing Pierre for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate. Thank you, Jacques Ranciere, for your gracious presence and the inspiration and challenge of your work. We've been asked very reasonably to be very brief, so I thought I would just frame my remarks as a single question. It's a very basic question, one that comes from my own preoccupations in reading Jacques Ranciere in the past and in discussing your work with students. I think it's a question that is raised even more centrally by Aisthesis, to the extent that this book elaborates an episodic history or counter-history of artistic modernity or the aesthetic regime from the late 18th century, Winkelmann, to James Agee, mid-20th century. So I'll try to frame it very, very quickly. It's not complicated, I think. As has already been articulated, Aisthesis undertakes across 14 different scenes or episodes to illustrate the emergence, beginning in the late 18th century, of art with a capital A as a separate and unified mode of experience. It also explores the paradoxical links between the emergence of what Jacques Ranciere calls the aesthetic paradigm or regime and the formation of new political communities or new forms of subjectivation. As in all of Jacques Ranciere's writing, concepts and categories are subjected to rigorous examination and redefinition. The terms aesthetics and politics are thrown into a new configuration, and prevailing narratives of art history, literary history, periodization are contested. But in the midst of these reevaluations, it seems to me that one notion, the category of the West, seems to remain remarkably stable. In the prelude or the preface to the book, you observe, and I'm going to quote quickly the sentence in translation, art has existed in the West only since the end of the 18th century. And there's, I think, some ambiguity to that statement, but could be taken to mean either that it has existed in that form elsewhere, or that it is a singularity of the West, perhaps. So the 14 episodes that are elaborated, that are presented, unfold in France, Germany, Britain, Russia, the United States. Many involve the reinterpretation of the heritage of ancient Greece and Rome. The aesthetic regime is situated, at least to some extent, loosely in relation to broad currents of European social and political history, as well as in relation, and more precisely, to previous European conceptions of art, notably the representational or mimetic paradigm. So the title, as you point out in the preface, alludes to Auerbach's seminal work, Mimesis, which is of course subtitled The Representation of Reality in Western Literature. So I would like to ask how you understand the status of this category of the West, which seems to be an a priori, but I wonder what kind of a priori it is. Aisthesis, like all of your work, subjects the idea of political communities and collectivities of reception to careful scrutiny. Is the West to be considered as a form of collectivity, as a form of community, or to be envisaged as a different kind of framework or matrix? The principle of a specific Western regime of art would seem to carry with it the implication of boundaries or margins, and I wonder how you imagine the relation to another from outside. Many of us, I think, have been tremendously inspired by your writing on the practices by which modern liberal democracies create internal borders and margins, zones of discrimination and exclusion that negate the principle of equality. I think, for example, of your recent writing about how, at the level of the state and through the medium of law in contemporary France, racism has been enacted, and on older work about dissensus in the wake of the massacre of Algerians in Paris in 1961. So I wonder, this is the last point of my question, how you envisage the relation between these critical interventions and an account of the history of aesthetics that seems to rest on the premise of Western specificity, if not Western singularity.
Well, to try to rethink, all the categories that have organized, forms of culture, forms of artistic practice, in those countries. But basically, I must rely on what I know, and try to I think the first thing, is trying to re-elaborate, the categories on which hierarchies, have functioned in our country, And because very often, there is a kind, of reverence, to, of course, to other cultures, etc., and some form, of course, of self-indictment, etc. But I think it's not very interesting. Either you are able to think, for instance, about the relations between the written word, and the image, in all civilization, and you are able really to make comparison that makes sense, and okay, But if not, I think for me it's better, really to stay, inside the tradition which has structured, the world in which we live, and in which, in fact, the world lives today. So I don't think that there is a contradiction between. In a way, it's the same kind of question, as a question, the question asked, by Phil, I don't think, that, an attempt at subverting, from the inside, one tradition of reinterpreting it. Well, we should oblige us, to embrace, all forms of practice, all regimes of interpretation, etc. I did something which is partial. I know it's partial, you know, and really I try to analyze what I could analyze from the point you know where I have been situated, from where I have been really, you know. I learned to see, I learned to perceive, I learned to categorize, you know, and well, I think it was enough for me. But of course, you know, I think that there are people who can do more, you know, and really, you know, this is my point, you know. Well, I don't speak about anything, you know, and precisely, you know, I think it would, if I wanted to embrace art in general, you know, it would be precisely, you know, a way of imposing Western categories, you know, to all regimes of practice that I don't want to do it.
A question about maybe the style of this book. It seems very different from your other books. I'm not as well read in your entirety of your work as my colleagues. But this book strikes me as unusual in relation to your others, partially because its method is in some ways more performative, you could say. You call it a staging. There is something about the ways in which these scenes are staged that makes it almost an experiential book. It's less, I would say, I know you don't like to be categorized as a philosopher, at least that's what I've heard, but it's less dominantly philosophical, even though it offers an ability to witness, you could say, your philosophical ideas at work in the aesthetic, in the medium of aesthetics. There's also a kind of a genealogy, and I'm curious about the ways in which I could call it a constellation, but that might be too Benjaminian. You know, would it be a constellation or a genealogy? I wonder how you would. You talk of scenes, even though they do implicitly have a relation to one another, especially in the kind of ultimate telos of the book, which is a redefinition of modernity. So I don't think it's an artificial telos. It's something that you see that there's an urgency to that in the way that you talk about it. So there's something about the way in which this book is written that makes it seem, and I hate to use this term, but I don't know what other term to use. I said performative, but also slightly testimonial. And I wonder what you would say to that. And testimonial, not in the sense in which you criticize Jean-Paul Sartre when you talk about turning art into sheer ethical testimony and erasing the autonomy, or erasing a kind of a function of art, suppressing the autonomy of art itself. But you talk about testimony, for example, in one of your essays, Contemporary Art and the Politics of Aesthetics. It's a short essay in which you talk about the four qualities of the dialectical form of the aesthetic dissensus in art today. And you talk about the joke, the collection, the invitation, the mystery. And you talk about the fourth mystery, that there's a mystery of co-presence, a testimony of co-presence. And I wonder about the status of testimony and what's being attested to here. So that's one of my questions. But and I have another one that I can say.
About the style of well, for me, you know, I had a problem, you know, during all my career, you know. The problem is that the books that people think, you know, are not theoretical, for me are theoretical, and the books people think are really philosophical are not. So they don't, and well, in a way, you know, for instance, well, I think this kind of performative writing, you know, you are perfectly right. Well, I would say it is my own way of doing what people call theory. Which for me is you know, theory comes from theorem, which means to see, you know. And for me, you know, for me doing theory, you know, if it means something, you know, means precisely changing the gaze, you know, the gaze on something, changing the mode of perception of something, you know. And you can do it precisely, you know, when you are performative, you know. So which means, for instance, that so the Nights of Labor, Proletarian Nights, you can say it's a performative book, you know. And it was horrible for so many people, you know, because there was no theory, you know. There was no theory. It was for for 100 pages, you know, and no theory about proletariat, etc. Just tales, you know, just narration, you know. And of course, people were really horrified, you know. And when I wrote, for instance, you know, disagreement, people were happy, you know, were happy because it was theory, you know, it was theory, and the truth is that I had to do it, of course, because this is a book which, in a sense, was written in English, you know, while Aisthesis on Nights of Labor was written in French. You know, meaning precisely, but for me, you know, my normal, you know, from my point of view, my good way of doing is precisely, you know, of introducing myself, you know, in a certain fabric of experience, you know, and trying, you know, step by step, you know, from this, well, to redefine, you know, categories and modes of perception, you know, that seem evident. You know. And this is what I try also to do in Aisthesis. Well, there is this history, this legend, you know, of modern art, modernity, etc., that was constructed by the Frankfurt School, by Clement Greenberg, and in a way re-elaborated, you know, by philosophers like Jean-François Lyotard. Precisely, you know, art as testimony, you know, of a certain situation, you know, of thinking, you know, also a certain situation of the human thinking animal. I don't think that my work is testimonial. You know, what it wants to do is, well, is just in a sense, you know, to grasp, you know, some knots, you know, between practice, performance, and discourse, you know, and by narrating them, you know, so an evening at the Folies Bergère, or an evening at the Funambule, you know, something like that, you know, an evening, you know, in Moscow in 1912 when Gordon Craig, you know, tried to make the staging of Hamlet with Stanislavski, you know. Well, in a way, I think, well, it's a way of trying, you know, to make, you know, the real fabric of experience, you know, within which there were those projects, those attempts, those performances, well, to make it perceptible, you know, and in a way, it proves nothing, you know, it proves nothing, and this is why, you know, I said, of course, you can see it is a counter history of modernity, but also in a way, you know, it's just a way of reinventing, from my point of view, of course, reinventing, you know, what art may have meant at a certain moment as the creation of a certain sphere of experience, you know, and in relation to life, you know. So while performative, yes, then I think it's necessarily, you know, it has to be performative for me to be a real, you know, work of thinking, you know. But well, testimonial. I don't know exactly, but you know, because of course, what is of course at the background, what is behind, you know, is the link of art with what I said before, you know, when I was answering, you know, Phil's question. What I try to suggest, and maybe it's a form of testimonial writing, is the link, you know, the link of so-called artistic modernity with this attempt, you know, of people, you know, of the lower class to live a new life, or to live any kind of life, you know, which is the reason why, you know, not the reason. retrospective reason, of course, why the book, the last scene, is, this, about James Agee, the sharecroppers, and the broken brains, of the daughter of the sharecropper, of the sharecropper, which, of course, in my view, is of course, to what I try, to say about Madame Bovary, in Politics of Literature.
So I'm going to make a couple of comments based on my experience as a translator and try to construct a question out of those comments. I've translated 3 of Jacques Ranciere's books. The first was Short Voyages to the Land of the People, which was published first in France in 1990, on the basis of articles that had appeared, I believe, primarily in Les Révoltes Logiques over the previous decade. This remains my personal favorite among the books that I've translated. It's an intensely beautiful book, both at the level of the sentence and at that of deep structure. It has a structural coherence, I think, that is especially remarkable, given that it began as separate essays. The opening chapter on Wordsworth is especially important for me, and I think representative of why so many of us find Jacques Ranciere's work so compelling, in the way that it locates Wordsworth's politics, not at the level of what he has to say about the French Revolution or about the Poor Laws, but in the most profound identity of his poetry as an encounter with a mundane object that is constituted as poetic by the solitary voyage that seeks it as the truth of common experience. Mute Speech, which appeared in translation just last year but came out in France all the way back in 1998, is the most systematically constructed, I think, of Jacques' writing on the history of aesthetics as the history of regimes of sensible experience. As such, it is, in my opinion, a key text. It's one that I had to work to get the rights to translate, and that I had to fight with somebody else, and that I was happy that I did. Only disagreement, I think, shares the sort of systematic exposition that characterizes Mute Speech among Jacques' works. While I haven't read the full text, my sense from the parts of this thesis that I heard in lectures is that it shares the narrative approach characteristic of the Short Voyages, but also of the Words of History, or the Knights of Labor. I will always think of it as the Knights of Labor when I speak English. They can change the title, An approach from multiple perspectives, which Jacques in interviews always associates with Virginia Woolf, in which the object is grasped through the discordances between these perspectives as much as through their agreement. So, in opposition to this sort of approach, Mute Speech contains an account of neoclassicism, or the representative regime of art, whose schematization echoes Foucault's classical episteme in ways that are, if I may dare say, brutally illuminating. I refer to it in the classroom as often as any exercise in literary history or literary theory that I've ever encountered. It's a way of explaining 17th and 18th century French literature. Works bang, bang, bang. It's schematized. It's really schematized, and there's a certain flattening of anything precise that one might want to say about Racine, for example, that occurs in that. Mute Speech also contains a sort of grand narrative of 19th and early 20th century French literature, running Balzac, Flaubert, Mallarmé, Proust, Artaud, Valéry, that is characterized by both a constant sense of literature as a problem to be resolved and by the beauty of its close readings. And I often think in particular of an extraordinary discussion of overturned bean poles from an early scene in Madame Bovary. In between these two, I translated a short essay. It's published as a book, but it's really not a book, on Freud called The Aesthetic Unconscious. I think that it has some really interesting things to say about how Freudian psychoanalysis relates to its historical moment, but I'm not particularly convinced that it played an important role in the development of Jacques' thought. What I do think is worth remarking upon here is that in comparison to Mute Speech, it was written I did the translation before, but it was written well after mute speech. It shows a tendency for the dynamism evident in the discussion of the aesthetic regime of art in mute speech to become what I would call internal differentiation and even opposition, so that there are particular interpretations of the aesthetic regime that oppose themselves to one another in a book like that. Also in the Régime du Sensible, I think, that came out about the same time. So here's roughly my question. It has to do with the relation between the schematization that's possible with respect to the aesthetic regime and the dynamism that characterizes all of the accounts of, the schematization that's possible with respect to the representative regime and the dynamism that characterizes all the accounts of the aesthetic regime. Is this a heuristic choice? One that is, we're going to schematize this so that it shows off this in greater clarity. I think that that's a real possibility, but I don't think it's just that. Within what I've called the dynamism of the aesthetic regime, do you think that I'm right to perceive a tendency both over the course of your accounts and over the history that you recount for internal dynamism and difference to become differentiation and opposition? Another way to put this is to ask whether you have whether you have recounted some scenes from the history of the aesthetic regime, or whether you in fact have recounted a history of the aesthetic regime that itself has a Aristotelian form of some sort. That is to say, a beginning, a middle, and a potential end. If it has a potential end, and I absolutely agree with you about your past rejections of the pertinence of the notion of the postponement, but is there a way in which we can understand the limits of the aesthetic regime? It strikes me that in many ways the account of dynamism that you've given is one in which infinite recuperation and containment is possible, and that there is no way in which a critique of the aesthetic regime can be mounted from within the aesthetic regime that does not reproduce its most fundamental structures.
Well, of course, I shall not answer to the whole question. Yes, let us say basically, I wrote some things, I did not write, I did not write a history of the aesthetic regime. Really, what I wanted to do was to isolate, a number of things, really that would make what happens, what kind of transformations happens, that make it perceptible, And it was very difficult. It was very difficult, because there are many events, that I could not comment, because my principle was, for each scene, I must have an event, a performance, and a text accounting for the performance. So that really, it is possible to get into this tissue, of perception, elaboration of perception, etc., etc. And well, there were a lot of and it's not so easy. So basically, for instance, I would have liked to write a chapter, on Seurat, on La Grande Jade, and it could have been, of course, it would have been very easy for me in a sense, But there was no interesting text. There are some texts, for Fénéon, but not very interesting, you know. And this is why, for instance, the chapter on Seurat was replaced by a chapter on Rodin, which is quite surprising in a sense, you know. But precisely because there is a kind of literature around Rodin, you know, which was at the same time, you know, an attempt, you know, by many critics, you know, well, to tell what has happened to art in the 1880s, 1890s. You know. There is no text. There is no text of this kind, you know, about Seurat, about Gauguin, you know, etc. So but there were those texts, and there was Rilke, so Rilke, which also were one of my permanent heroes, you know, permanent characters, you know, in all my work, you know, which wrote a text which in a way was also a kind of synthesis, you know, of what could be said about Rodin, what could be said about Rodin as a kind, you know, of artists, you know, resolving the contradictions, the contradiction between naturalism and symbolism, you know, at the moment, etc.
I also have two questions, but maybe I'll ask one and then we can see how we're doing for time. So the larger agenda of the first question is to get you talking about cinema, and I'll ask what'll maybe be a somewhat obvious question, but I think it'll be interesting to hear your answer. Aisthesis has discussions of Chaplin and Vertov, but I want to ask a question that might be an opportunity for you to say something about two other books you've recently published that haven't yet been released in English, which is to say the volume on Denis and this Les Écarts du Cinéma, the gaps of cinema, book of essays on cinema. So the question, and this can be maybe a way to say more about those books as well, but the question I was going to frame was concerns the status of cinema in relation to art. So you've said that the aesthetic regime breaks down the hierarchies between high and low art and entertainment and so on. At the same time, I think there's this sort of common perception today, perhaps in the US even more than France, of that the category of art functions to construct a boundary or a hierarchy between what counts as art and what does not count as art. And then correspondingly, the notion that there are those who have the capacity to understand art and those who only enjoy reality television, romance novels, pop music, and so on. And so it's a division that is perhaps explicitly visible in cinema, in which it's said that there are movies that everybody enjoys on a Sunday afternoon, and then there are these other things we call art films that, depending on who you ask, are either the one true kind of cinema, or from the opposite perspective, are really only a genre of film that's meant to appeal to or flatter the cultured sensibilities of a certain class, and sort of Bourdieu critique of distinction. So since a number of the more contemporary films and filmmakers you write on, Bélatar, Pedro Costa, and so on, are considered makers of what often gets called art cinema. My question is, first, more broadly, does cinema pose any particular complications for the aesthetic regime of art that are not posed by, say, literature, painting, and so on? And more specifically, how does one explain the prevalence of this idea of art, and that's attached to the art world as well as, I think, art cinema, as a hierarchical concept distinct from, the commodified pleasures of the rabble and so on, if in fact the concept of art as it emerged in the aesthetic regime of art in your argument undoes that distinction in the first place. So how do we then explain the persistence, I guess, of that distinction in your view?
Well, okay. Well, in fact, I think that cinema, always had kind of ambiguous status. Certainly within the aesthetic regime. In a way, it was the art what was expected by the aesthetic, by the aesthetic logic itself, you know, and this is what I commented on, you know, in film fables, you know, commenting on that text, on those texts of, you know, of filmmakers and theorists, you know, like Jacques, you know, thinking that now, yes, there is a possibility of this new thinking in images, speaking in images, and you know, and of course, getting rid of all those old narratives and characters and psychology and so on. And of course, that did not happen, you know. But we know that at the same time, you know, of course, so in the 1920s, there were all those attempts, you know, and also was in all those interpretation, you know. And of course, you know, I focused on Chaplin and on Vertov because precisely in both cases, you know, it's about the limits of art and non-art, you know. And you know, on the one hand, you know, Chaplin was of course celebrated because it was popular entertainment as great art, as high art, and at the same time, and so it was thought precisely, you know, as kind of evidence of this new art that was able really to disrupt, you know, the whole hierarchy, you know, between high art and popular art, and on the other hand, you know, with Vertov, there was the idea of a form of art which is no more art, but it is just a kind of link, you know, between all the activities that made the new communist, the new communist world. You know. So two ideas of cinema as the art, which at the same time is no art, or as the popular art, which at the same time, you know, is a perfection of true art. You know. And we all know that what happened, of course, you know, is, well, in a way, is that the industrialization of art meant in a way the restoration, you know, of the barriers, you know, and in a way, you know, the point is not that industry is against art, you know. The point is that industry imposes precisely the distribution between what is artistic and what is entertainment, you know. And but also there is the fact, you know, that even, you know, cinematographic industry was a kind of very strange industry, because what else also, you know, the industry within which there was this kind of distribution, you know, of roles, you know, waves, you know, the so-called director, not the cameraman, you know, all those people who most, you know, more or less, you know, in fact, could invest, you know, their aesthetic, their artistic dreams or artistic skills, you know, well, in what was supposed to be just industrial cinema and commercial cinema, and which is what happened, you know, what happened in Hollywood, and was the basis for cinephilia, because what was cinephilia, you know, precisely, notably in France in the 1960s, you know, was this kind of rehabilitation of so-called, you know, commercial cinema, Hollywood cinema, saying this is art, and precisely restoring, you know, this indistinction between art and non-art, you know. But of course, you know, but also that, well, since that time, you know, industry could you know, perhaps make a new step, you know, and really create all the basis, you know, the basis for the correct distribution, you know, giving to everybody what they want, you know, either art or entertainment, or entertainment with some art, or art which is somehow entertaining. You can think of Almodovar, for instance, which was a kind of typical, I think, you know,